Robert Goldberg sags into his desk chair and gestures at the air. Frankenstein monsters, things crawling out of the lab, he says. This the most depressing thing I've ever dealt with. Goldberg, a plant molecular biologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, is not battling psychosis. He is expressing despair at the relentless need to confront what he sees as bogus fears over the health risks of genetically modified (GM) crops. Particularly frustrating to him, he says, is that this debate should have ended decades ago, when researchers produced a stream of exonerating evidence. Today we're facing the same objections we faced 40 years ago. Across campus, David Williams, a cellular biologist who specializes in vision, has the opposite complaint. A lot of naive science has been involved in pushing this technology, he says. 30 years ago we didn't know that when you throw any gene into a different genome, the genome reacts to it. But now anyone in this field knows the genome is not a static environment. Inserted genes can be transformed by several different means, and it can happen generations later. The result, he insists, could very well be potentially toxic plants slipping through testing. Williams concedes that he is among a tiny minority of biologists raising sharp questions about the safety of GM crops. But he says this is only because the field of plant molecular biology is protecting its interests. Funding, much of it from the companies that sell GM seeds, heavily favors researchers who are exploring ways to further the use of genetic modification in agriculture. He says that biologists who point out health or other risks associated with GM crops, who merely report or defend experimental findings that imply there may be risks, find themselves the focus of vicious attacks on their credibility, which leads scientists who see problems with GM foods to keep quiet. Whether Williams is right or wrong, one thing is undeniable: despite overwhelming evidence that GM crops are safe to eat, the debate over their use continues to rage, and in some parts of the world, it is growing ever louder. Skeptics would argue that this contentiousness is a good thing, that we cannot be too cautious when tinkering with the genetic basis of the world's food supply. To researchers such as Goldberg, however, the persistence of fears about GM foods is nothing short of exasperating. In spite of hundreds of millions of genetic experiments involving every type of organism on Earth, he says, and people eating billions of meals without a problem, we've gone back to being ignorant. So who is right, advocates of GM or critics? When we look carefully at the evidence for both sides and weigh the risks and benefits, we find a surprisingly clear path out of this dilemma. Benefits and worries: the bulk of the science on GM safety points in one direction. Take it from David Silberman, a UC Berkeley agricultural and environmental economist and one of the few researchers considered credible by both agricultural chemical companies and their critics. He argues that the benefits of GM crops greatly outweigh the health risks, which so far remain theoretical. The use of GM crops has lowered the price of food. Silberman says, it has increased farmer safety by allowing them to use less pesticide. It has raised the output of corn, cotton and soy by 20 to 30%, allowing some people to survive who would not have without it. If it were more widely adopted around the world, the price of food would go lower, and fewer people would die of hunger. In the future, Silberman says, those advantages will become all the more significant. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that the world will have to grow 70% more food by 2050 just to keep up with population growth. Climate change will make much of the world's arable land more difficult to farm. GM crops, Silberman says, could produce higher yields, grow in dry and salty land, withstand high and low temperatures, and tolerate insects, disease and herbicides. Credit Jen Christensen. Despite such promise, much of the world has been busy banning, restricting and otherwise shunning GM foods. Nearly all the corn and soybeans grown in the U.S. are genetically modified, but only 2 GM crops, Monsanto's MON 810 maize and BASF Samflora potato, are accepted in the European Union. 10 EU nations have banned MON 810, and although BASF withdrew Amflora from the market in 2012, 4 EU nations have taken the trouble to ban that, too. Approval of a few new GM corn strains has been proposed there, but so far it has been repeatedly and soundly voted down. Throughout Asia, including in India and China, governments have yet to approve most GM crops, including an insect-resistant rice that produces higher yields with less pesticide. In Africa, where millions go hungry, several nations have refused to import GM foods in spite of their lower costs, the result of higher yields and a reduced need for water and pesticides. Kenya has banned them altogether amid widespread malnutrition. No country has definite plans to grow golden rice, a crop engineered to deliver more vitamin A than spinach. Rice normally has no vitamin, even though vitamin A deficiency causes more than 1 million deaths annually and 500,000 cases of irreversible blindness in the developing world. Globally, only a tenth of the world's cropland includes GM plants. 4 countries, the US, Canada, Brazil and Argentina, grow 90% of the planet's GM crops. Other Latin American countries are pushing away from the plants. And even in the US, voices decrying genetically modified foods are becoming louder. In 2016, the US federal government passed a law requiring labeling of GM ingredients in food products, replacing GM labeling laws in force or proposed in several dozen states. The fear fueling all this activity has a long history. The public has been worried about the safety of GM foods since scientists at the University of Washington developed the first genetic